We're here today in London for our Why series, asking the question, why religion? Is all religion bad? Is religion irrational, immoral? Is it sexist? Is it racist and anti-gay and unloving? And is all religion dangerous?
Is the person or persons who are causing that violence acting in keeping with their worldview or in violation of their worldview? And again, I think every worldview has to answer that question for themselves.
A lot of people have very strong views on morality, but they don't necessarily have a strong foundation of where they've got to in those views. And so it's helpful to have a strong, biblical-based, rational response to some of these topics.
The way that it was presented would make anyone think, an atheist, an agnostic, anyone. So I think it was brilliant.
How sobering to be giving a talk on is religion dangerous? Or would the world be a safer place without religion? Just days after, yet again, another religiously motivated act of terror and violence here in the heart of our great city in Westminster, actually not far from here at all. And I can imagine at dinner tables all over the country this week, conversations about those crazy religious people with their dangerous ideas, and someone else chipping in and saying, absolutely, if we didn't have religion, we wouldn't have terrorism. We wouldn't have all the violence that we have in the world. If we didn't have these people of faith, these God believers, there wouldn't be these conflicts in the Middle East. There wouldn't be these troubles in Northern Ireland. There wouldn't be inane and senseless violence about words in holy books written thousands of years ago. And I wonder if you have ever been at a dinner party when the conversation has gone along those lines, and you're sitting there as someone who believes in God, a religious person in that sense, and what are you feeling in that moment, in that conversation? Maybe a sense of confusion, conflict within, a possible sense of guilt that, yes, you are one of these God believers. You're a religious person. Or maybe this sense of nervousness. I just hope that the group doesn't turn their eyes to me and look at me and make that connection. Or even ask me what I think about religion. And maybe you're not sure what you think about religion anymore. Maybe this attack in just the last few days has you reeling and wondering whether perhaps they're just right. You know, maybe the world would indeed be a safer place without all this religion. According to Linda Woodhead, who's a professor of sociology of religion at Lancaster University, religion is what marketing people would call nowadays a toxic brand. There was a survey done by the Huffington Post UK in 2014 which stated that the majority of people in Britain believe that religion overall is a force for harm in our society. And for many, this week's attack is painfully calling to mind remembrances about the London suicide bombings, 7/7. And I don't know if you remember the leader of that group, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who videotaped a statement about the reasons behind what it was that he was going to do. And then in that statement, he said these words. He said, "I and thousands like me are forsaking everything for what we believe. Our drive, our motivation doesn't come from tangible commodities that this world has to offer. Our religion is Islam. This is our ethical stances are dictated. We are at war, and I am a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation." And of course we are. This is very real. We are experiencing the reality of this particular perspective on life. This talk is not just an abstract theological discussion. This is very real, and this is very raw. And the link that terrorists like Khan make between their faith in things beyond this world and their violence in this world just reconfirms to many people this already common view that religion inevitably and inherently is dangerous, leads to evil and leads to violence. And of course, this view that it does is further backed up by new atheist writers, so-called new atheist writers, who, echoing the statements of John Lennon's song Imagine, argue that religion is the main reason that we don't have peace in our world. And if you can imagine a world without war and without violence, you are imagining a world without religion. Christopher Hitchens argued that religion is poisonous. It poisons everything that it touches. Richard Dawkins said that religion is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Sam Harris, in his book, The End of Faith, said religion is the most prolific source of violence in our history. And this atheist rhetoric, as you read it, sometimes goes so far as to suggest that lurking within every single religious believer lies a potential terrorist. So if you want to get rid of war and violence and make things safe, just get rid of all religion. Are they right? Would the world be a safer place without religion? Is all religion just inherently dangerous? Such a significant question for our times. And because such a significant question, it requires some really careful thinking and analysis. I think we need to ask two important clarifying questions. Question number one, we need to ask whether it's true. Is it actually true that religion is the most prolific source of violence in our history? Does the historical data actually support that claim? And secondly, in those instances where violence has been committed in the name of religion, is it really because any and all religious belief is just inherently dangerous, as new atheists suggest? Or are there some necessary distinctions that need to be made, or some other factors that need to be taken into account? So let's begin with the first question. Is religion really the main cause of violence in our world? Well, in a recently published book, Encyclopedia of Wars, authors Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod document the history of recorded warfare. And from their list of 1,760 wars throughout human history, they attribute 123 of those wars to involving a religious cause, which is actually less than 7% of all wars. And if you ask the question in terms of casualties, wars with a religious element actually account for less than 2% of all people killed in warfare. Now, what history is clear about, however, is that hundreds of millions of more deaths have been caused by irreligion than by any religious worldview. To give some examples, 60 million people killed under Mao Zedong's communism, 15 million under Joseph Stalin's communism. You've got millions more under Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia. And when you take just these three atheistic regimes alone, whose official government policy was to wipe religion out of society, and you have upwards of 100 million deaths last century alone. And just as those numbers of those killed under atheist regimes is often vastly underestimated in public consciousness, so too the number of those who've been killed at the hands of religious violence is vastly overestimated in public consciousness. For example, the Inquisition, which is one of those things that many people turn to as an example of the evils of religion, it didn't claim hundreds of thousands of lives, as people often assume or assert. It actually claimed about 6,000 lives over a period of 3.5 centuries. In comparison, Stalin's atheistic regime claimed 6,000 lives a week. Moreover, the historian John Wolfe points out that even where, in those situations, religion clearly is a factor, say for example Northern Ireland, he says it's almost always overplayed as an influence. For example, there's a well-known joke about The American tourist who walks into a bar, I need to thank Gareth for this one, who is from Northern Ireland. An American tourist walks into a bar in Belfast, and a group of scary-looking men surround him and demand to know whether he is a Protestant or a Catholic. Now, the confused tourist says, actually, he's an atheist, at which point the leader of the group looks him in the eye and says, yeah. But are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist? Now, the reason this joke is funny and works is because you can actually imagine that happening. And the reason that you could imagine it happening is because even though we say, oh yeah, that's a religious conflict, actually, the factors underlying the conflict, there's much more there than just religion. There's politics of displacement and identity politics and a whole history there, which means that often religion is just the presenting factor. It's just a veneer. Similarly, with the so-called wars of religion of the 16th and 17th century that raged throughout Europe, going on beneath the surface are other factors: dynastic influence, power, economics, which are actually just as important. And so, in short, what the data teaches us is that religious violence is actually only a minority of human violence. And secondly, where religion has been a factor of violence, rarely is it the case that religion is the sole factor. In other words, in answer to the question, the historical data simply does not support the new atheist claim that religion is the primary cause of war and violence in our world. Therefore, getting rid of religion will not solve the human problem of war and conflict. In fact, statistically speaking, it would hardly make a dent in this problem. And you've got to ask the practical question, how would we get rid of religion anyway? When by far the majority of people throughout the world, let's look globally here, are religious. And when the best of modern cognitive science tells us that as human beings, we are naturally hardwired to be religious. That even those who call themselves atheists are actually suppressing their natural religious instinct. That's secular cognitive scientists who are saying this. Now, you could outlaw religious belief. You could go down that path. You could try to make it illegal. But again, as history demonstrates time and time again, states which officially adopt atheism as an ideology always end up oppressing people. The fall of the Great Wall in 1989 should be a symbolic caution to the world not to forget that important lesson of history. So let's move on to the second important question then. What about those instances where violence has been caused in the name or committed in the name of religion? What's the real reason for that violence? Is it because any and all religious belief is just inherently dangerous? Or are their answers more nuanced than that? When you read the atheist critique of religions, you could be forgiven for concluding that all religions must be the same. There seems to be very little effort made to make any distinction, intellectual, rational, or moral, between one type of religious belief and another. And yet, just speaking simply, I don't know how many thoughtful people who would equate Osama bin Laden and Mother Teresa in the same moral category simply because they were both religious people. The first dedicated to violence, the second dedicated to a life of self-sacrificial love. The attempt made by new atheist writers to sort of lump all religious people into one category is simplistic at best, dishonest at worst, as if the world could somehow be divided up into two groups, the fair-minded and enlightened atheists on the one hand, and the bigoted and evil religious people on the other. Interestingly though, whenever one speaks of the evils committed under the irreligious schemes of Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, as I just did a moment ago, atheists are very, very quick to make the point that not all atheists are evil and immoral like that. And they're right. Of course they're not. But do you see, the point. The fact that atheists don't want to be arbitrarily classified with violent extremists who hold their same atheistic worldview shows that they expect that people can discriminate between different types of atheists. Why then do the new atheists appear unable to discriminate between different religions? All atheists are not the same, and neither are all religions. We need to move beyond a sort of guilt by association mode of rhetoric in which the lady helping at the food bank, motivated to do so by her love for God, is put into the same moral category as the man who carried out the attack in Westminster this week. Oxford professor of religion, Keith Ward, points out that the real question is not, is religion dangerous? As if all religions are the same, but is this particular religion, in its current form, dangerous? Now, each religion has to answer that question for themselves. As a Christian, I can only speak for Christianity, and Christianity has done marvelous things in this world, but we also have to say that Christendom's record is not without blemish. Christians should be the first to put up their hands and say, actually, the church has not always done a great job of representing Christ. Sometimes it's done a really lousy job of representing Christ. Now, according to the website, Christian website, shipoffools.com, in this website, what I'm about to read out to you comes from this website, and it is regarded as officially the funniest religious joke, at least according to their online poll. Now, here goes. I have a habit of making the best jokes sound mediocre, but still, I'll give it a go. I was walking across a bridge one day, and I saw a man standing on the edge about to jump. I ran over and said, "Stop, don't do it." "Why shouldn't I?" he asked. "Well, there's so much to live for," I said. "Like what?" "Are you religious?" "Yes." "Oh, me too. Are you a Christian or Buddhist?" "Christian." "Me too. Are you Catholic or Protestant?" "Catholic." "Protestant." "Oh, me too. Are you Episcopalian or Baptist?" "Well, Baptist." "Oh, me too. Are you Baptist Church of God or Baptist Church of the Lord?" "Baptist Church of God." "Me too. Are you Original Baptist Church of God or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God?" "Reformed Baptist Church of God." "Me too. Are you Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1879, or Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915? He said, Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915. I said, "Die, heretic scum," and pushed him off the bridge. Okay. Well, now, how does this joke work? Well, I think the reason, how to kill a joke by unpacking it, right? But I think the reason it works is that what it insinuates is just completely ridiculous and yet at the same time manages to cut extremely close to home. Christendom has a lot to answer for the Inquisition and for religious wars and for any time it's attempted to enforce its belief or its doctrine by vitriol or political pressure or violence. Now, even today, some of the vitriol that you will read online from people who call themselves Christians against those who disagree with them is awful. It's petty, it's tribal, it's unloving, and it's un-Christ-like. And that's the point. It's un-Christ-like. It's unlike Christ. It's unlike Christianity. Whenever these things have been done in the name of Christianity, they've always been done in violation of Christianity, in violation of the teachings of Christ himself, without whom we would not have Christianity. It's been well said that we must be very careful not to judge any worldview by its abuse. In order to determine in any given scenario whether the particular religion itself really is the chief cause of the violence, we need to ask, is the person or persons who are causing that violence acting in keeping with their worldview or in violation of their worldview? And again, I think every worldview has to answer that question for themselves. As a Christian, I would point out that in Jesus' first sermon, he declares that it's the poor in spirit, the persecuted, the meek, and the peacemakers who are blessed. He says not to return violence with violence, but to turn the other cheek. If someone is suing you for your coat or your shirt, give them your coat also. In other words, meet hate with love. Love your enemies. Now, the atheist Friedrich Nietzsche, he scorned Christianity and Jesus for this very reason, that Jesus promoted weakness as a virtue. What Nietzsche perceived as weakness anyway, a self-sacrificial life of love. Now, when you read the Bible, you see that Jesus Christ himself, he never sought to dominate other people. He never sought political or military power to enforce himself or his teachings on others. At the critical moment of his ministry, Jesus didn't come riding into Jerusalem on a white stallion with a giant sword to conquer. He came riding in on a donkey to die. And when he was being arrested, he didn't resist. His disciple Peter tried to resist and pulled out a sword and cut off a guy's ear. Jesus said, "No, Peter, put away the sword." And he actually healed the man's ear. And we have a wonderful demonstration of the outrageous love of Jesus Christ in action, healing the one who had come to hurt him. And his example has undeniably inspired millions of people throughout history to love their neighbors and even their enemies in the most trying of circumstances. When I became a Christian, one of the first Christian books that I ever read was about a Dutch Christian lady called Corrie ten Boom. She tells her story about how she became a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp of war with her father and her sister for helping Jews to escape the Holocaust. Now, she was the only member of her family to survive that experience. Decades later, she came face to face with one of her cruel captors. And although she admits that she did not have the power within herself to forgive this man, by God's strength and God's enabling, she was able to embrace his hand and to forgive him. There are so many stories like this throughout history, and yet when you read some of the new atheist writing, it seems like they could scarcely bring themselves to concede that a single human benefit has flowed from Christian faith. And yet history demonstrates that Christians motivated by Christ throughout the centuries have done more than any other group to champion reconciliation and to combat injustice and slavery and genocide, infanticide, and promote education, access to science and the arts and political freedom and social justice, and to pioneer hospitals and orphanages and charitable societies and law reform and so much of what we enjoy today. And yet, in an interview with The Sun magazine in September 2006, the new atheist Sam Harris stated unequivocally that religion was the greatest evil. He said that if he could wave a magic wand and get rid of either rape or religion, he would not hesitate to get rid of religion. But there's an uncomfortable tension for an atheist when you bring up the subject of evil. I think the term evil loses any real meaning in a universe where God is removed from the picture. Let me explain. Even Richard Dawkins himself said, if there is no God, which he believes, then the universe in which we live has at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, this is exactly what the atheist philosopher Nietzsche pointed out long ago, that if we remove God from the picture, then we remove any objective moral reference point for determining right from wrong. And Dostoevsky put it even more simply when he said, if God is dead, all is permitted. But of course, to deny the existence of any objective morality goes completely against the grain of every human instinct. For it would be to deny that horrendous things like terrorism, like rape, like sexism, like racism are not objectively wrong, but from a rational perspective, that is where it leads you to moral relativism. And as Oxford professor Keith Ward, who I mentioned a moment ago, makes the point, it's when people feel that life is pointless, that there's no point in trying to be good, that existence itself is some sort of cruel or regrettable accident, that they surrender to sadistic and destructive impulses. In short, it's a lack of faith in the value of existence and in the possibility of goodness that is likely to lead to pure evil. Now, I don't know if you've ever visited the former concentration camp of Auschwitz, but if you do, you cannot help being deeply affected by the reality of pure evil. You see a side of human nature that none of us want to admit is there. And you see written next to those gas ovens a quote from Hitler: "I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel." Now, few people today are aware of the profound influence that Nietzsche's atheistic philosophy had upon Hitler, that it actually provided the conceptual framework for his systematic regime of obliterating those that he considered weak and inferior. The Nobel Prize-winning poet Czesław Miłosz said, "A true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for all our betrayals, our greed, our cowardice, and our murders, we're not going to be judged." He said, "The opium of modernity is the belief that there is no God, so that humans are free to do precisely as they pleased." This is spoken by a man who experienced oppression under both the Nazi and the Soviet regimes. Getting rid of God, that's not the answer to getting rid of evil. To paraphrase my favorite thinker, G.K. Chesterton, if there be one thing morally certain, it is that the world would be a much more violent place without belief in God than it ever has been with belief in God. Is all religion dangerous? No. Is some religion dangerous sometimes? Yes. But even where it is, I would suggest that it's not the root of the problem, that our biggest problem actually lies much deeper. And let me put it like this. We could say money's dangerous. Money causes resentment, bloodshed, division, and poverty. So money poisons everything, and we should get rid of money. Or politics. Politics causes division and bloodshed and war. So politics poisons everything, and we should get rid of politics. How about science? Science causes terrifying weapons of mass destruction. So science poisons everything, and so we should get rid of science. What about democracy? Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. Should we do away with democracy as well? And clearly the answer is not to do away with money and politics and science and democracy or religion, even though people can and have used those things to cause damage. So what's the problem? It's us. We're the common factor in every problem. The poison is actually within. It's as Solzhenitsyn wrote, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds and we could just round them all up and exterminate them. But he says the line dividing good and evil runs between every human heart, and who would want to destroy a piece of his own heart? His point, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. Evil's very real. And Christianity takes evil seriously. That's why at the center of Christianity, there's a cross. Jesus experienced the reality of evil, human evil on the cross, and he defeats that evil, not by returning evil with evil, but by taking it on himself and laying down his life on the cross for you and for me. Now, my friend Tom Tarrance is a wonderful Christian mentor to me and a number of my colleagues. And he was once described as the most dangerous man in Mississippi. He was a racist, he was a terrorist, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and his group had started bombing Jewish synagogues. Tom was eventually captured in a bloody shootout in which he was shot multiple times. A couple of people were shot and killed. Tom managed to survive. And for his first year in prison, Tom continued to feed the hate that fueled his previous activities by reading books such as The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and Mein Kampf. But when he had nothing else left to do, he started reading the Bible. And he says, the light came on. I found myself knowing that I needed the grace of God and the forgiveness of my sins. For the first time, what Jesus did on the cross for me became really precious and personally important to me. And when the FBI agent who arrested Tom and who had called him a mad dog killer met Tom after his conversion, this hardened FBI agent said, "At that point, I knew in my heart that there was such a thing as a born-again experience." And this FBI agent eventually became a Christian as well, and the two have become lifelong friends. Now, I've only known Tom Tarrance, in the last couple of years, but I find it just incredible to believe that 30-plus odd years ago, he was a hate-filled terrorist. Today, honestly, he is the most gentle and caring man you could possibly imagine, and his love knows no boundaries. Is all religion dangerous? No. Not all religion is dangerous. Is it sometimes dangerous? Yes. Just about every ideology, religion, worldview, including atheism, can be and has the potential to be dangerous, because every single human heart has the potential to be bigoted, arrogant, superior, violent, obsessed with power, and obsessed with being right. But what Tom's story so clearly demonstrates is that God is in the business of transforming human hearts. It's his love and his forgiveness through the cross that has the power to radically transform even the most hate-filled heart into a heart of compassion and love and grace. Jesus is not the cause of the world's problems. I'm convinced he is the only answer to our deepest problem, the problem within. It's not about religion, it's about a relationship that begins with an admission of need and is met with an embrace of grace. Let me finish with the words of Jesus himself. Jesus once spoke a parable to those who trusted in their religiosity rather than God. He said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a religious leader and the other a tax collector. The religious leader stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus said, "I tell you that the tax collector, rather than the religious leader, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who humble themselves will be exalted." Let me close in prayer. Father God, we do pray and cry out for our world at the moment, Lord, for this city. Lord, just that we inhabit a world that is so full of violence and conflict and so full of twisted ideologies that devalue human life and justify evil and terror in the name of God. And we pray particularly for London, Lord, and for the victims and families and victims of this week's evil attack. Lord, we pray that this would not turn people away from you, God, but would turn them to you in prayer. And Lord Jesus, I pray for those who turn to you in prayer. Lord, I pray that you would meet them in their fear and in their grief, and that they would experience your reality and your love. And Lord, I want to pray too for anyone who's ever been hurt by the church. Perhaps there are some in this room who've experienced indifference or judgment or even abuse rather than compassion and grace and care. And Lord, would you help them to see your love for them despite the unloving actions of those who falsely claimed to represent your love. And Lord, finally, have mercy on all of us, sinners, and forgive us for times that we ourselves have not represented you well, when we've been unloving or unkind. And we pray that you continue to work in our hearts, helping us to truly live the lives of love that you've called us to. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for your questions that have been coming in on Pigeonhole. If you've been writing down your questions, can I ask the team just to gather the questions up from around the room, and we'll have the questions coming forward even as I just take 10 minutes to ask Simon some questions. Simon, as you can see, there are a number of questions that have come in. I'd love you to take that first one. I'll just read it out in case you're too far to see the wording of it. How do we reconcile the accounts of narratives in the Old Testament that seemingly point to endorsement of violence? How do we reconcile the Old Testament account?
Yeah, fantastic. It's a really good question because the question needs to be framed in this perspective. The question is not, does Christianity endorse genocide and violence? The answer is clearly not. Jesus made that very clear. Theologians don't disagree about that question. We are to love our enemies. So the question is not, does it condone violence? But given that it doesn't, how do you explain this particular passage or these passages in the Old Testament? I think hard to do justice in a short amount of time to a very complex question, but let me say a few things that might be helpful. The first point to recognize is that when you read the Old Testament, you do read about a lot of violence. And it's important to remember that not everything that's written down in the Old Testament is written there in order for you to emulate what has happened there. Often it's descriptive, not prescriptive, that God is asking us to be violent. Often it's very clear that the passage is saying, here's where things go if you stop listening to God, if you start taking things into your own hands. But we also need to bear in mind that sometimes, on some rare occasions, those who are God's people, the Israelites, went to war. And what do we understand about those passages? Well, again, the vast majority of passages are very clear that even though it was a tribal warfare place where people would attack and be attacked, God in the Old Testament laid down very clear parameters and guidelines for if Israel ever is in war, how they should act. That there needed to be justice, that there needed to be fairness. For example, that they needed to give their enemies opportunity to surrender rather than avoid senseless attack and violence. Then, in a very small case, exceptional case, and this is to do with the Canaanites, when the Israelite group came out of Egypt through the desert and to come into the promised land, there are occasions where God instructed them to attack and wipe out the Canaanites. And you're like, how does that even make any sense given what we've been talking about? This comes to a very important question. Can God judge? Can God judge? Now, from a Christian perspective, God is the only person who has the full knowledge, wisdom, data to be able to make fair judgment calls. Now, today it's very clear Christians are not called to judge, but in a very specific time of biblical history, God judged other nations through Israel. At the same time, God used other nations to judge Israel. So it's not sort of ethnic favoritism. God at times used nations to judge other nations. But even then, it's not as if it's just based on ethnicity, it's just random, God has a preference for this group of people. There's a background, there's a context, and there's a story. And in the case of the group of people roughly defined as Canaanites in the Promised Land, we know further back that the Lord had said that these people, their time of judgment has not yet come. So you get this picture in the Old Testament that there's a period of 400 years in which the sins and the crimes of a certain people group are just adding up and adding up and adding up. And so this is not just a very quick response of violence. And when we look at some of the crimes that we're talking about the systematic abuse and sacrifice of children to the god of Molech and other gods. So you look at it and say, okay, there's not without some reason that a particular group has just got to so systemically a bad situation that God's judgment, that even normal people would cry out for some sort of justice, God to do something. But then you've got the bigger question as well. Well, what about the innocents in that town? What happened to them? Were they all wiped out, as passages seem to suggest? And then we look at that and say, scholars today say a lot of the language in the Bible is hyperbolic, it's hyperbole. As in, even today, we say, oh, how did you go at your soccer game? Oh, we wiped them out. I'm not literally saying you wipe people out. It's hyperbolic language to say we had the victory. And again, a lot of the passages can be interpreted in that context, that this is hyperbolic language. And we see even when it says that they were wiped out or told to be completely wiped out, passages later, many of these people still exist. So that clearly is not literally the case. Even if you're looking at all that and still going, but still I just don't get it. My advice to you as remembering what it's like to be looking at the Bible for the first time is, when you're ever in doubt, just go back to Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that God was doing and wanted to do through his people on the earth and failed to do. And Jesus is very clear. Put away the sword. Judgment is mine. Do not judge, or you too shall be judged. If you want to know any more about this, then come and see me afterwards, and I can recommend a few helpful books as well. It's a very complex subject.
Let me cut in with you've brought us to Jesus. That's actually the heart of the next question, which is, how do we respect or follow a God who uses the violent method of the cross to deal with violence? Now, I think this will be the last question that we have time for with Simon specifically, but Simon, I wonder if you can wrap up some of your thoughts in the next few minutes with that before we go into the break.
Thank you. As I said, Christianity takes evil very seriously. I mean, evil's not a joke. If you've ever experienced or been a victim of other person's brutality or violence. But a lot of people say, okay, I don't get it. Why would God have to go to all this theatrical sort of semblance to put Jesus on a violent cross is he just into gore and is he just into violence? And why couldn't he just say, I forgive you? That's it. We can do it today. I forgive you. I think a wonderful illustration of the fact that forgiveness is hugely costly is the story of a guy who stole his mate's car, drove it, wrecked it, and then afterwards felt contrite about it, went to his mate and said, oh, I'm really sorry, do you forgive me? And his mate, who loved his crazy friend, said, yes, I forgive you. But then there's still a cost to be paid, right? Someone has to pay the cost of a new car. When we're talking about what the forgiveness that God offers us through Jesus Christ, we're talking about a cost that is cosmic. We're talking about the sins and the evils and the moral brokenness and the shame and the guilt of every single human being throughout history. I don't think for God to just snap his finger and say, I forgive you, would actually help us understand the reality. And there's a lot of mystery when it comes to the cross. There's an awful lot of mystery. But when in our human heart, we have a deep, deep longing for there to be justice and something done, and a deep, deep need for forgiveness. And we see that on the cross, this longing for justice and this longing for mercy is met in Jesus Christ, who takes what we deserved and the consequences of our moral brokenness and shame and the mess that we've made of this world, and takes it on himself. And at the same time offers forgiveness, and you see justice and mercy kiss. Is there mystery? Yes, but it is a marvelous mystery of grace.